And there we go. Let's see if we can get the closed caption working. I'm here. Paul Bonk. Hi, Kane and Manor. Thank you for dropping in. How are you both? I do hope you're both well. Back to sleep, not moving. I think it should be picking my sound up. Tummy hurts a bit, regret eating shrimp. Oh no, well, make sure to rest yourself a little bit, and I hope you feel better. Kane finally caught a stream. You did, from the beginning no less. Not the tail end. Good job, Kane. Oh, sorry, got a frog in my throat today. How are you? Hope your day's been... My day's been rather nice and peaceful. It's been very warm today. I've spent the day playing a abomination mod list for Fallout 4. Over 350 mods. And it's going well. Finally I can play the game as Todd intended. At 4 times its actual file size. We're painting today, and no, we're not reading the King in Yellow book club. We're reading the next chapter of the King in Yellow. Maybe another one if I'm being generous. Or depending on how long it takes. So I hope everyone has a nice drink to hydrate with. I wouldn't really call it ASMR. It's like listening to an audio tape, really. What did I say? Yeah. I hope everyone's got a nice drink by the side. A warm drink of tea or something, or a glass of milk, or just some water. And I hope everyone's nice and comfy and has a blanket or plush toy or a loved one to hug. And I hope everyone has been having a nice day ready for this. Because, or if not, I hope you're all well rested. And I hope you enjoy being able to just relax. Listen to the rest of a good book. And, you know, just have a nice day. Because I'm having a lovely one. So let's begin. And hopefully, my text-to-speech hasn't. Can't tell if my closed captions are actually working or not. Or just very laggy. Add a sub reward. You did do it. What would you like me to add to the list for next week? Let's open the list up. What would you like to add, Kane? Speak in daddy voice. What's a I have to ask first, what's a daddy voice? I don't know what that is. What's a daddy voice? You can think of something else if you want. But I'm very curious as to what a daddy voice is. Anyway, just let me know what else you would like to do instead, and I can get it added. Have you eaten? I have eaten. Yeah, I actually just ate my dinner before we started. So I'm a full bat. Have you eaten, Manna? And have you eaten, Kane? Do you have a snack ready, or have you? Are you going to eat lunch soon, or dinner, or breakfast even? You haven't. Well, that's not good. Shrimp and fried rice. That sounds lovely. Unless it's the shrimp that are making your tummy hurt, in which case that's less lovely. But no, if you decide what you'd like adding to the list instead, just let me know. Well then, and hopefully you can hear me alright over the rain noises. I had them playing last time. I was told that they sounded nice, so I thought I'd keep them playing again. But hopefully the sound is still working fine, and you can hear me over it. Chapter 2. The Mask. Camilla. You, sir, should unmask. Stranger. Indeed. Camilla. Indeed, it's time. We all have laid aside disguise for you, but you. Stranger. I wear no mask. Camilla, terrified, aside to Casilda. No mask. No mask! The King in Yellow. Act 1, Scene 2. Although I knew nothing of chemistry, I listened fascinated. He picked up the Easter lily which Genevieve had brought that morning from Notre Dame and dropped it into the basin. Instantly, the liquid lost its crystalline clearness. For a second, the lily was enveloped in a milky white foam, which disappeared, leaving the fluid opalescent. Changing tints of orange and crimson played over the surface, and then what seemed to be a ray of pure sunlight struck through from the bottom where the lily was resting. At the same instant, he plunged his hand into the basin and drew out the flower. There is no danger, he explained. If you choose the right moment, that golden ray is the signal. He held the lily toward me, and I took it in my hand. It had turned to stone, to the purest marble. You see, he said, it is without a flaw. What sculptor could reproduce it? The marble was as white as snow, but in its depths the veins of the lily were tinged with the palest azure, and a faint flush lingered deep in its heart. Don't ask me the reason of that, he smiled, noticing my wonder. I have no idea why the veins and heart are tinted, but they always are. Yesterday I tried one of Genevieve's goldfish. There it is. The fish looked as if sculpted in marble, but if you held it to the light, the stone was beautifully veined with a faint blue, and from somewhere within a rosy light like the tint which slumbers in an opal. I looked into the basin. Once more it seemed filled with clearest crystal. If I should touch it now, I demanded. I don't know, he replied, but you'd better not try. There is one thing I'm curious about, I said, and this is where the ray of sunlight came from. It looked like a sunbeam, true enough, he said. I don't know. It always comes when I immerse any living thing. Perhaps, he continued smiling, perhaps it is the vital spark of the creature escaping to the source from whence it came. I saw he was mocking, and threatened him with a mahl stick, but he only laughed and changed the subject. Stay to lunch. Genevieve will be here directly. I saw her going to early mass, I said, and she looked as fresh and sweet as that lily, before you destroyed it. Do you think I destroyed it? Said Boris gravely. Destroyed, preserved, how can we tell? We sat in the corner of a studio, near his unfinished group of the Fates. He leaned back on the sofa, twirling a sculptor's chisel and squinting at his work. By the way, he said, I have finished pointing up that old academic Ariadne, and I suppose it will have to go to the salon. It's all I have ready this year, but after the success of Madonna brought me, I feel ashamed to send a thing like that. The Madonna. An exquisite marble for which Genevieve had sat had been the sensation of last year's salon. I looked at the Ariadne. It was a magnificent piece of technical work, but I agreed with Boris that the world would expect something better of him than that. Still, it was impossible now to think of finishing in time for the salon that splendid, terrible group half shrouded in the marble behind me. The Fates would have to wait. We were proud of Boris Yvain. We claimed him and he claimed us on the strength of his having been born in America, although his father was French and his mother was a Russian. Everyone in the Beaux Arts called him Boris, and yet there were only two of whom he addressed in the same familiar way, Jack Scott and myself. Perhaps my being in love with Genevieve had something to do with his affection for me. Not that it had ever been acknowledged between us, but after all that was settled, and she had told me with tears in her eyes it was Boris whom she loved. I went over to his house and congratulated him. The perfect cordiality of that interview did not deceive either of us, I always believed, although to what, at least, it was a great comfort. I do not think he and Genevieve ever spoke of the matter together, but Boris knew. Genevieve was lovely. The Madonna-like purity of her face might have been inspired by the Sanctus in Gonad's Mass. But I was always glad when she changed that mood for when we called her April Manoeuvres. She was often as variable as an April day, in the morning grave, dignified and sweet, and at noon laughing, capricious, and evening whatever one least expected. I preferred her so rather than in that Madonna-like tranquility which stirred the depths of my heart. I was dreaming of Genevieve when he spoke again. So what did you think of my discovery, Alec? I think it's wonderful. I shall make no use of it, beyond satisfying my own curiosity as may be, and the secret will die with me. It would be rather a blow to sculpture, would it not? We painters lose more than we ever gain by photography. Boris nodded, playing with the edge of the chisel. This new vicious discovery would corrupt the world of art. Now I shall never confide the secret to anyone, he said slowly. It would be hard to press to find anyone less informed about such phenomena than myself, but of course I had heard of mineral springs so saturated with silica that the leaves and twigs which fall into them would turn to stone after a time. I simply comprehended the process, how the silica replaced the vegetable matter, atom by atom, and the result was a duplicate of the object in stone. This, I confess, had never interested me greatly, and as for the ancient fossils thus produced, they disgusted me. Boris, it appeared, feeling curiosity instead of repugnance, had investigated the subject and had accidentally stumbled on a solution which, attacking the immersed object with a ferocity unheard of, in a second did the work of years. This was all I could make out of the strange story which he had been telling me. He spoke again after a long silence. I am almost frightened when I think what I have found. Scientists would go mad over the discovery. It was so simple too. It discovered itself. When I think of that formula and that new element precipitated in metallic scales, Oh, bit of a woody one there. What new element? Oh, I haven't thought of naming it, and I don't know if I ever shall. There are enough precious metals now in the world to cut throats over. I pricked up my ears. Have you struck gold, Boris? No, better. But see here, Alec, he laughed, starting up. You and I have all we need in this world. Ah, how sinister and covetous you look already. I laughed too, and I told him I was devoured by the desire for gold, and we had better talk of something else. So when Genevieve came in shortly after, we had turned our backs on alchemy. Quick sip. Genevieve was dressed in silvery grey from head to foot. The light glinted along the soft curves of her fair hair. She turned her cheek to Boris. Then she saw me and returned my greeting. She had never before failed to blow me a kiss from the tips of her white fingers, and I promptly complained of the omission. She smiled and held out her hand, which dropped almost before it was touched mine. Then she said, looking at Boris, "You must ask Alice to stay. You must ask Alec to stay for luncheon." This also was something new. She had always asked me herself until today. I did, said Boris shortly. And you said yes, I hope? She turned to me with a charming, conventional smile. I might have been an acquaintance on the day before yesterday. I made her a low bow. Je vais bien l'honneur, madame. Je vais bien l'honneur, madame. We now have French. Excellent. But refusing to take up our usual bantering tone, she murmured a hospitable commonplace and disappeared. Boris and I looked at one another. I'd better go home, don't you think? Hanged if I know, he said. You replied frankly. While we were discussing the advisability of my departure, Genevieve reappeared in the doorway without her bonnet. She was wonderfully beautiful, but her colour was too deep and her lovely eyes were too bright. She came straight up to me and took my arm. Luncheon is ready. Was I cross, Alec? I thought I had a headache, but I haven't. Come here, Boris. And she slipped her other arm through his. Alec knows that after you there is no one in the world whom I like as well as I like him, so if he sometimes feels snubbed, it won't hurt him. La honneur, I cried. Who says there are no thunderstorms in April? Are you ready? Chanted Boris. Aye, ready. And arm in arm, we raced into the dining room, scandalising the servants. After all, we were not so much to blame. Genevieve was 18, Boris was 23, and I'm not quite 21. Sip my tea before it goes cold. Oh. Some work that I was doing about this time on the decorations for Genevieve's boudoir kept me constantly at the quaint little hotel in the Rue Saint-Cécile. Boris and I, in those days, laboured hard, but as we pleased, which was fitfully, and we all three, with Jack Scott, idled a great deal together. One quiet afternoon, I had been wandering alone over the house, examining curios, prying into odd corners, bringing out sweetmeats and cigars from strange hiding places, and at last I stopped in the bathing room. Boris, all over clay, stood there washing his hands. The room was built of rose-coloured marble except the floor, which was tessellated in rose and gold. In the centre was a square pool sunken below the surface of the floor. Steps led down to it, sculpted pillars supported a fresco ceiling. A delicious marble Cupid appeared to have just alighted on his pedestal at the upper end of the room. The whole interior was Boris's work and mine. Boris, in his working clothes of white canvas, scraped the traces of clay and red modelling wax from his handsome hands and coquetted over his shoulder with the Cupid. I see you, he insisted. Don't try to look the other way and pretend not to see me. Just, you know who made you, little humbug. It was always my role to interpret Cupid's sentiments in those conversations, but when my turn came, I responded in such a manner that Boris seized my arm and dragged me towards the pool, declaring he would dunk me. Next instant, he dropped my arm and turned pale. Good God, he said. I forgot the pool is full of the solution. I shivered a little, and dryly advised him to remember better where he had stored his precious liquid. In heaven's name, why do you keep a small lake of that gruesome stuff here of all places? I want to experiment on something large, he replied. On me, for instance? Ah, that came too close to suggesting, but I do want to watch the action of that solution on a more highly organised living body. There is that big white rabbit, he said, following me into the studio. Jack Scott, wearing a paint-stained jacket, came wandering in, appropriated all the oriental sweetmeats he could lay his hands on, looted the cigarette case, and finally he and Boris disappeared together to visit the Luxembourg Gallery, where a new silver bronze by Rodin and a landscape by Monet were claiming the exclusive attention of artistic France. I went back to the studio and resumed my work. It was a Renaissance screen which Boris wanted me to paint for Genevieve's boudoir, but the small boy who was unwillingly dawdling through a series of poses for it, today refused all bribes to be good. He never rested an instant in the same position, and inside of 5 minutes I had as many different outlines of the little beggar. Are you posing, or are you executing a song and dance, my friend? I inquired. Whichever monsieur pleases, he replied with an angelic smile. Of course I dismissed him for the day, and of course I paid him for the full time, that being the way we spoil our models. After the young imp had gone, I made a few perfunctory daubs at my work, but was so thoroughly out of humour that it took me the rest of the afternoon to undo the damage I had done. So at last I scraped my palette, struck my brushes in a bowl of black soap, and strolled into the smoking room. I really believed that, excepting Genevieve's apartment, no room in the house was so free from the perfume of tobacco as this one. It was a queer chaos of odds and ends, hung by the threadbare tapestry. A sweet-toned old spinet in good repair stood by the window. There were stands of weapons, some old and dull, others bright and modern, festoons of Indian and Turkish armour over the mantel, 2 or 3 good pictures and a pipe rack. It was here that we used to come for new sensations in smoking. I doubt if any type of pipe ever existed which was not represented in that rack. When we had selected one, we immediately carried it somewhere else and smoked it, for the place was, on the whole, more gloomy and less inviting than any in the house. But this afternoon the twilight was very soothing. The rugs and skins on the floor seemed brown and soft and drowsy. The big couch was piled with cushions. I found my pipe and curled up there for an unaccustomed smoke in the smoking room. I had chosen one with a long flexible stem, and lighting it fell to dreaming. After a while it went out, but I did not stir. I dreamed on and presently fell asleep. I awoke to the saddest music I had ever heard. The room was quite dark, and I had no idea what time it was. A ray of moonlight silvered one edge of the old spinet, and the polished wood seemed to exhale the sounds as perfume floats above a box of sandalwood. Someone rose in the darkness and came away weeping quietly, and I was fool enough to cry out Genevieve. She dropped at my voice, and I had time to curse myself while I made a light and tried to raise her from the floor. She shrank away with a murmur of pain. She was very quiet, and asked for Boris. I carried her to the divan, and went to look for him, but he was not in the house, and the servants were gone to bed. Perplexed and anxious, I hurried back to Genevieve. She lay where I had left her, looking very white. I can't find Boris, or any of the servants, I said. I know, she answered faintly. Boris has gone to Epte with Mr. Scott. I did not remember when I sent you for him just now. But he can't get back in that case before tomorrow evening, and are you hurt? Did I frighten you into falling? What an awful fool I am, but I was only half awake. Boris thought you had gone home before dinner. Do please excuse us for letting you stay here all this time. I had a long nap, I laughed. So sound that I did not know whether I was asleep or not, when I found myself staring at a figure that was moving toward me, and I called out your name. Have you been trying the old spinet? You must have played very softly. I would tell 1,000 more lies worse than that one to see the look of relief that came to her face. She smiled adorably and said in a natural for Alec, I tripped on the wolf's head and I think my ankle is sprained. Please call Marie and then go home. I did as she bade me and left her there when the maid came in. Yeah, left her there when the maid came in. Let's finish off this mouthful of tea. At noon next day when I called, I found Boris walking restlessly about his studio. Genevieve is asleep just now. The sprain is nothing, but why should she have such a high fever? The doctor can't account for it, or else he will not, he muttered. Genevieve has a fever? I asked. I should say so, and has actually been a little light-headed at intervals all night. The idea, gay little Genevieve without a care in the world, and she keeps saying her heart's broken and she wants to die. My own heart stood still. Boris leaned against the door of his studio. Looking down, his hands in his pockets, his kind, keen eyes clouded, a new line of trouble drawn over the mouth's good mark that made the smile. The maid had ordered to summon him the instant Genevieve opened her eyes. We waited, and Boris, growing restless, wandered about, fussing with modelling wax and red clay. Suddenly he started for the next room. Come and see my rose-coloured bath full of death, he cried. Is it death? I asked to humour his mood. You are not prepared to call it life, I suppose, he answered. As he spoke, he plucked out a solitary goldfish squirming and twisting out of its globe. We shall send this one after the other, wherever that is, he said. There was a feverish excitement in his voice, a dull weight of fever lay on my limbs and on my brain as I followed him to the fair crystal pool in its pink-tinted sides, and he dropped the creature in. Falling, its scales flashed with a hot orange gleam in its angry twisting and contortions. The moment it struck the liquid, it became rigid and sank heavily to the bottom. Then came the milky foam, the splendid hues radiating on the surface, and then the shaft of pure, serene light broke through from seemingly infinite depths. Boris plunged his hand in and drew out the exquisite marble thing, blue-veined, rose-tinted, and glistening with opalescent drops. Child's play, he muttered, and looked wearily, longingly at me, as if I could answer such questions. But Jack Scott came in and entered into the game, as he called it, with ardour. Nothing would do but to try the experiment on the white rabbit there and then. I was willing that Boris should find distraction from his cares, but I hated to see the life go out of a warm living creature, and I declined to be present. Picking up a book at random, I sat down in the studio to read. Alas, I had found The King in Yellow. After a few moments, which seemed ages, I was putting it away with nervous shudder when Boris and Jack came in bringing the marble rabbit. At the same time, the bell rang above, and a cry came in from the sick room. Boris was gone like a flash, and the next moment he called, Jack, run for the doctor, bring him with you. Alex, come here. I went and stood at her door. A frightened maid came out in haste and ran away to fetch some remedy. Genevieve, sitting bolt upright with crimson cheeks and glittering eyes, babbled incessantly and resisted Boris's gentle restraint. He called me to help. At my first touch she sighed and sank back, closing her eyes, and then, as we still bent over her, she opened them again, and looked straight into Boris's face, poor fever-crazed girl, and told her secret. At the same instant, our three lives turned into new channels. The bonds that held us together so long snapped forever, and a new bond was forged in its place. For she had spoken my name, and as the fever tortured her, her heart poured out its load of hidden sorrow. Amazed and dumb, I bowed my head, while my face burned like a live coal, and the blood surged into my ears, stupefying me with its clamour. Incapable of movement, incapable of speech, I listened to her feverish words in agony of shame and sorrow. I could not silence her. I could not look at Boris. Then I felt an arm upon my shoulder, and Boris turned a bloodless face to mine. It's not your fault, Alec. Don't grieve so if she loves you. But he could not finish. And as the doctor stepped swiftly into the room, saying, the fever, I seized Jack Scott and hurried him to the street, saying Boris would be alone. Saying Boris would rather be alone. We crossed the street to our own apartments, and that night, seeing I was going to be ill too, he went to the doctor again. The last thing I recollect with any distinctness was hearing Jack say, "For heaven's sake, Doctor, what ails him to wear a face like that?" And I thought of the King in Yellow and the pallid mask. I was very ill, for the strain of 2 years which I had endured since the fatal May morning when Genevieve murmured, "I love you, but I think I love Boris best," told on me at last. I had never imagined that it could become more than I could endure. Outwardly tranquil, I had deceived myself. Although the inward battle raged night after night, and I, lying alone in that room, cursed myself for rebellious thoughts, unloyal to Boris and unworthy of Genevieve, the morning always brought relief, and I returned to Genevieve and to my dear Boris with a heart washed clean by the tempests of the night. Never in word or deed or thought or with them had I betrayed my sorrow even to myself. The mask of self-deception was no longer a mask for me. It was a part of me. Night lifted it, laying bare the stifled truth below, but there was no one to see except myself, and when the day broke, the mask fell again of its own accord. These thoughts passed through my trembled mind as I lay sick, and they were hopelessly entangled with visions of white creatures, heavy as stone, crawling about in Boris's basement, of the wolf's head on the rug, foaming and snapping at Genevieve, who lay smiling beside it. I thought too of the King in Yellow wrapped in the fantastic colours of his tattered mantle, and the battle cry of Casilda, "Not upon us, O King, not upon us." Feverishly, I struggled to put it from me, but I saw the lake of Harley, thin and blank without a ripple or wind to stir it, and I saw the towers of Carcosa behind the moon, Aldebaran and the Hades, Allah, Hasta glided through the cloud rifts which fluttered and flapped as they passed like the scalloped tatters of the King in Yellow. Among all these, one sane thought persisted. It never wavered, no matter what else was going on in my disordered mind, that my chief reason for existing was to meet some requirement of Boris and Genevieve. What this obligation was, its nature was never clear. Sometimes it seemed to be protection, sometimes support, through a great crisis. Whatever it seemed to be for the time, its weight rested only on me, and I was never so ill or so weak that I did not respond with my whole soul. There were always crowds of faces about me, mostly strange, but a few I recognised, Boris among them. Afterwards they told me that this could not have been, but I know that once at least he bent over me. It was only a touch, a faint echo of his voice. Then the clouds settled back on my eyes and I lost him. But he did stand there and bent over me once at least. At last, one morning I woke to find the sunlight falling across my bed and Jack Scott reading beside me. I had not strength enough to speak aloud, neither could I think, much less remember, but I could smile feebly as Jack's eyes met mine, and when he jumped up and asked eagerly if I wanted anything, I could whisper only, "Yes, Boris. Boris." Jack moved to the head of my bed and leaned down to arrange my pillow. I did not see his face, but he answered heartily, "You must wait, Alec. You are too weak to see even Boris." I waited, and I grew strong. In a few days I was able to see whom I would, but meanwhile I thought and remembered. From the moment when all the past grew clear again in my mind, I never doubted what I should do when the time came, and I felt sure that Boris would have resolved upon the same course so far as he was concerned. As for what pertained to me alone, I knew he would see that also, as I did. I no longer asked for anyone. I never inquired why no message came from them, or during the week I lay there, waiting and growing stronger, I never heard their names spoken. Preoccupied with my own searching for the right way, and with my feeble but determined fight against despair, I simply acquiesced in Jack's reticence, taking for granted that he was afraid to speak of them, lest I should turn unruly and insist on seeing them. Meanwhile, I said over and over to myself, how would it be when life began again for us all? We would take up our relations exactly as they were before Genevieve fell ill. Boris and I would look into each other's eyes, and there would be neither rancour nor cowardice nor mistrust in that glance. I would be with them again for a little while in the dear intimacy of their home, and then, without pretext or explanation, I would disappear from their lives forever. Boris would know. Genevieve, the only comfort was that she would never know, it seemed. It seemed, as I thought it over, that I had found the meaning of that sense of obligation which had persisted all through my delirium, and the only possible answer to it. So when I was quite ready, I beckoned Jack to me one day and said, "Jack, I want Boris at once, and take my dearest greeting to Genevieve." When at last he made me understand that they were both dead, I fell into a wild rage that tore all my little convalescent strength to atoms. I raved and cursed myself into a relapse, from which I crawled forth some weeks afterwards, a boy of 21 who believed that his youth was gone forever. I seemed to be past the capability of further suffering, and one day when Jack handed me a letter and the key to Boris's house, I took them without a tremor and asked him to tell me all. It was cruel of me to ask him, but there was no help for it, and he leaned wearily on his thin hands to reopen the wound which could never entirely heal. He began very quietly. "Alec, unless you have a clue that I know nothing about, you will not be able to explain any more than I what has happened. I suspect that you would rather not hear these details, but you must learn them, else I would spare you the relation. God knows I wish I could be spared the telling. I shall use few words. That day when I left you in the doctor's care and came back to Boris, I found him working on the fates. Genevieve," he said, "was sleeping under the influence of drugs. She'd been quite out of her mind," he said. He kept on working, not talking any more, and I watched him. Before long, I saw the third figure of the group, the one looking straight ahead, out over the world, bore his face. Not as you ever saw it, but as it looked then and to the end. This is one thing for which I should like to find an explanation, but I never shall. While he worked, and I watched him in silence, and he went on that way until nearly midnight. Then we heard the door open and shut sharply, and a swift rush into the next room. Boris sprang through the doorway, and I followed, but we were too late. She lay at the bottom of the pool, her hand across her breast. Then Boris shot himself through the heart. Jack stopped speaking, drops of sweat stood under his eyes, and his thin cheeks twitched. I carried Boris to his room. Then I went back and let that hellish fluid out of the pool, and turning on all the water, washed the marble clean of every drop. When at last I dared descend the steps, I found her lying there as white as snow. At last, when I decided that was best to do, I went into the laboratory and first emptied the solution into the waste pipes. Then I poured the contents of every jar and bottle after it. There was wood in the fireplace, so I built a fire, and breaking the locks on Boris's cabinets, I burnt every paper, notebook, and letter which I found there. With a mallet from the studio, I smashed to pieces all the empty vials, then loading them into a coal scuttle, I carried them to the cellar and threw them over the red-hot bed of the furnace. 6 times I made the journey, and at last not a vestige remained of anything which might again aid in seeking for the formula which Boris had found. Then at last I dared call the doctor. He's a good man, and together we struggled to keep it from the public. Without him I never would have succeeded. At last we got the servants paid and sent away into the country where old Rosier keeps them quiet with stories of Boris and Genevieve's travels in distant lands, from whence they will not return for years. We buried Boris in the little cemetery of Sèvres. The doctor is a good creature, and I know when to pity a man who can bear no more. He gave his certificate of heart disease and asked no questions of me. Oh no, and he knows when a man can when to pity a man who can bear no more. Okay. Yes, as voice continue. Don't worry, I'm a hey, Looper. Get cozy. Then, lifting his head from his hands, he said, "Open the letter, Alec. It is for both of us." He tore it open. It was Boris's will dated a year before. He left everything to Genevieve, and in case of her dying childless, I was to take control of the house in the Rue Saint Cecile, and Jack Scott the management at Ept. On our deaths, the property reverted to his mother's family in Russia, with the exception of the sculptured marbles executed by himself. Those he left to me. The page blurred under our eyes, and Jack got up and walked to the window. Presently he returned and sat down again. I dreaded to hear what he was going to say, but he spoke with the same simplicity and gentleness. Genevieve lies before the Madonna in the marble room. The Madonna bends tenderly over her, and Genevieve smiles back into that calm face that never would have been except for her. His voice broke, but he grasped my hand, saying, "Courage, Alec. Next morning, he left for Ep to fulfill his trust. Have a little sip of my water now. He's gone, and reading gives me a very dry mouth, apparently. Who knew? Who knew that reading it out loud would make you thirsty? The same evening, I took the keys and went into the house I had known so well. Everything was in order, but the silence was terrible. Though I went twice to the door of the marble room, I could not force myself to enter. It was beyond my strength. I went into the smoking room and sat down before the spinet. A small lace handkerchief lay on the keys, and I turned away, choking. It was plain I could not stay, so I locked every door, every window, and the 3 front and back gates, and went away. Next morning, Alcide packed my valise, and leaving him in charge of my apartments, I took the Orient Express for Constantinople. During the next 2 years that I wandered through the East, at first in our letter we never mentioned Genevieve and Boris, but gradually their names crept in. I recollect particularly a passage in one of Jack's letters replying to one of mine. What you tell me of seeing Boris bending over you while you lay ill and feeling his touch on your face and hearing his voice, of course troubles me. This that you describe must have happened a fortnight after he died. I say to myself that you were dreaming, that it was part of your delirium, but the explanation does not satisfy me, nor would it you. Toward the end of the 2nd year, a letter came from Jack to me in India, so unlike anything I had ever known of him that I decided to return at once to Paris. He wrote, I am well, and sell all my pictures as artists do, who have no need of money. I have not a care of my own, but I am more restless than if I had. I was unable to shake off a strange anxiety about you. It is not apprehension, it is rather a breathless ecstasy of what God knows. I can only say it is wearing me out. Nights I dream always of you and Boris. I can never recall anything afterwards, but I wake in the morning with my heart beating, and all day the excitement increases until I fall asleep at night to recall the same experience. I am quite exhausted by it. I have determined to break up this morbid condition. I must see you. Shall I go to Bombay, or will you come to Paris? I telegraphed him to expect me on the next steamer. When we met, I thought he had changed very little. He insisted, looked in splendid health. It was good to hear his voice again. As we sat and chatted about what life still held for us, we felt like it was pleasant to be alive in the bright spring weather. We stayed in Paris together a week, and when I went for a week to Ep with him, but first of all we went to the cemetery in Sèvres, where Boris lay. Shall we place the Fates in the little grove above him? Jack asked, and I answered, I think only the Madonna should watch over Boris's grave. But Jack was none the better for my homecoming. The dreams of which he could not retain even the last definite outline continued, and he said that at times the sense of breathless expectancy was suffocating. You see, I do you harm and not good, I said. Try a change without me. And he started alone for a ramble among the Channel Islands, and I went back to Paris. I had not yet entered Boris's house, now mine since my return, but I knew it must be done. It had been kept in order by Jack. There were servants there, so I gave up my own apartment and went there to live. Instead of the agitation I had feared, I found myself able to paint there tranquilly. I visited all the rooms, all but one. I could not bring myself to enter the marble room where Genevieve lay, and yet I felt the longing grow daily to look upon her face and to kneel beside her. One April afternoon I lay dreaming in the smoking room, just as I had lain 2 years before, and mechanically I looked among the tawny eastern rugs for the wolfskin. At last I distinguished the pointy ears and flat cruel head, and I thought of my dream where I saw Genevieve lying beside it. The helmets still hung against the threadbare tapestry, among them the old Spanish morion, which I remember Genevieve had once put on when we were amusing ourselves with the ancient bits of mail. I turned my eyes to the spinet. Every yellow key seemed eloquent on her caressing hand, and I rose, drawn by the strength of my life's passion, to the sealed door of the marble room. The heavy doors swung inward upon my trembling hands. Sunlight poured through the window, tipping with gold the wings of Cupid, and lingered like a nimbus over the brows of the Madonna. Her tender face bent in compassion over a marble form so exquisitely pure that I knelt and sighed myself. Genevieve lay in the shadow under the Madonna, and yet through her white arms I saw the pale azure vein, and beneath her softly clasped hands the folds of her dress were tinged with rose, as if from some faint warm light within her breast. Bending with a breaking heart, I touched the marble drapery with my lips, then crept back into the silent house. A maid came and brought me a letter, and I sat down in the little conservatory to read it. As I was about to break the seal, seeing the girl lingering, I asked her what she wanted. She stammered something about a white rabbit. She stammered something about a white rabbit which had been caught in the house, and asked what should be done with it. I told her to lay it loose in the walled garden behind the house, and opened my letter. It was from Jack, but so incoherent that I thought he must have lost his reason. It was nothing but a series of prayers to me not to leave the house until he could come back. He could not tell me why. There were the dreams, he said. He could explain nothing, but he was sure that I must not leave the house in the Rue Sainte-Cécile. As I finished reading, I raised my eyes and saw the same maid-servant standing in the doorway holding a glass dish with which 2 goldfish were swimming. Put them back in the tank and tell me what you mean by interrupting me. With a half-suppressed whimper, she emptied water and fish into an aquarium at the end of the conservatory, and turned to me asking my permission to leave my service. She said people were playing tricks on her, evidently with the design of getting her in trouble. The marble rabbit had been stolen and a live one had been brought into the house. The two beautiful marble fish were gone, and she had just found these common live things flopping on the dining room floor. I reassured her and sent her away, saying I could look into it myself. I went to the studio. There was nothing there but my canvases and some cases except for the marble of the Easter lily. I saw it on a table across the room. Then I strode angrily over to it. But the flower I lifted from the table was fresh and fragile and filled the air with perfume. Then suddenly I comprehended, and sprang through the hallway to the marble room. The doors flew open and sunlight streamed into my face, and through it in a heavenly glory the Madonna smiled as Genevieve lifted her flushed face from the marble couch and opened her sleepy eyes. We'll have a stretch. The stretch is good. We've been reading for an hour now. Everyone else have a stretch too if you can. And have a little sip. And on to the next chapter. In the court of the dragon. O thou who burnest in heart for those who burn in hell, whose fires thyself shall feed and turn, how long be crying mercy on them, God? Why, who art thou to teach, and he to learn? In the church of St. Barnaby, vespers were over. The clergy left the altar, the little choir boys flocked across the chancel, and settled in the stalls. A Suis, in rich uniform, marched down the south aisle, sounding his staff at every fourth step on the pavement. Behind him came the eloquent preacher and good man, Monsignor C. The way this is written is just C and then a dash, and then a full stop. So I don't know if C is meant to mean something or that's just an initial. My chair was near the chancel rail. I now turned toward the west end of the church. The other people between the altar and the pulpit turned too. There was a little scraping and rustling while the congregation seated itself again. The preacher mounted the pulpit stairs and the organ voluntarily ceased. I had always found the organ playing at St. Barnaby's highly interesting. Learned and scientific it was, too much so for my small knowledge, but expressing a vivid if cold intelligence. Moreover, it possessed the French quality of taste. Taste reigned supreme, self-controlled, dignified and reticent. Today, however, from the first chord I felt a change for the worst. A sinister change. During Vespers it had been chiefly the chancel organ which supported the beautiful choir. But now and again, quite wantonly as it seemed, from the west gallery where the great organ stands, a heavy hand had struck across the church at the serene peace of those clear voices. It was something more than harsh and dissonant, but it betrayed no lack of skill. As it recurred again and again, it set me thinking of what my architect's books say about the custom in early times to consecrate the choir as soon as it was built, and that the nave, being finished sometimes half a century later, often did not get any blessing at all. I wondered idly if that had been the case at St. Barnaby, whether something not usually supposed to be at home in a Christian church may have entered undetected and taken possession of the West Gallery. I have read of such things happening too, but not in the works on architecture. Then I remembered that St. Barnaby was not much more than 100 years old, and smiled at the incongruous association of medieval superstitions with that cheerful little piece of 18th century rococo. But now Vespers were over, and there should have followed a few quiet chords fit to accompany meditation, while we waited for the sermon. Instead of that, the discord at the lower end of the church broke out with the departure of the clergy, as if nothing could control it. I belong to those children of an older and simpler generation who do not love to seek for psychological subtleties in art, and I have ever refused to find in music anything more than melody and harmony. But I felt that in the labyrinth of sound now issuing from that instrument there was something being hunted. Up and down the pedals chased him, while the manuals blared approval. Poor devil, whoever he was, there seemed small hope of escape. My nervous annoyance changed to anger. Who was doing this? How dare he play like that in the midst of divine service? I glanced at the people near me. Not one appeared to be in the least disturbed. The placid brows of the kneeling nuns still turned towards the altar, lest none of their devout abstraction under the pale shadow of their white headdress. Lost in their devout abstraction. The fashionable lady beside me was looking expectantly at Monsignor C. For all her face betrayed, the organ might have been singing an Ave Maria. But now at last the preacher had made the sign of the cross and commanded silence. I turned to him gladly. Thus far I had not found the rest I had counted on when I entered St. Barnaby's that afternoon. I was worn down by 3 nights of physical suffering and mental trouble. The last had been the worst. It was an exhausted body and a mind benumbed and yet acutely sensitive, which I had brought to my favourite church for healing, for I had been reading The King in Yellow. The sun ariseth, they gather themselves together, and lay them down in their dens. Monsignor C. delivered his text in a calm voice, glancing quietly over the congregation. My eyes turned, I knew not why, toward the lower end of the church. The organists were coming from behind his pipes, and passing along the gallery on his way out, I saw him disappear by a small door that leads to some stairs, which descended directly to the street. He was a slender man, and his face was as white as his cloak was black. Good riddance, I thought, with your wicked music. I hope your assistant will play the closing voluntary. With a feeling of relief, with a deep, calm feeling of relief, I turned back to the mild face in the pulpit and settled myself to listen. Here at last was the ease of the mind I had longed for. My children, said the preacher, one truth the human soul finds hardest for all to learn, that it has nothing to fear. It can never be made to see that nothing can really harm it. Curious doctrine, I thought, for a Catholic priest. Let us see how he will reconcile that with the Father's. Nothing can really harm the soul, he went on, in his coolest, clearest tones, because nothing. But I never heard the rest. My eye left his face. I knew not for what reason, and sought the lower end of the church. The same man was coming out from behind the organ. I was passing along the gallery the same way. But there had not been time for him to return. If he had returned, I must have seen him. I felt a faint chill, and my heart sank. And yet his going and coming were no affair of mine. I looked at him. I could not look away from his black figure and his white face. When he was exactly opposite me, he turned and sent across the church, straight to my eyes, a look of hate, intense and deadly. I had never seen any other like it. Would to God I might never see it again. Then he disappeared by the same door from which I had watched him depart less than 60 seconds ago. I sat and tried to collect my thoughts. My first sensation was like that of a very young child badly hurt, when it catches its breath before crying out. To suddenly find myself the subject of such hatred was exquisitely painful, and this man was an utter stranger. Why should he hate me so? Me, who had never seen him before? For the moment all other sensation was merged in this one pang. Even fear was subordinate to grief, and for that moment I never doubted, but in the next I began to reason, and a sense of the incongruous came to my aid. As I said, St. Barnaby is a modern church. It is small and well lighted. One sees all over it almost at a glance. The organ gallery gets a strong white light from the row of long windows in this clerestory, which have not even coloured glass. The pulpit being in the middle of the church, it followed that when I turned towards it, whatever moved at the west end would not fail to attract my eye. When the organist passed, it was no wonder that I saw him. He has simply miscalculated the interval between his first and his second passing. He had come in that last time by the other side door. As for the look which so upset me, there had been no such thing, and I was a nervous fool. I looked about. This was a likely place to harbour supernatural horrors. That clear-cut, reasonable face of Monsignor C, his collected manner and easy, graceful gestures, which were not just a little discouraged to the notion of gruesome mystery. Were they not just a little discouraging to the notion of gruesome mystery? I glanced above his head and almost laughed. That fly-away lady supporting one corner of the pulpit canopy, which looked like a fringed damask tablecloth in a high wind, at the first attempt of a basilisk to pose up there in the organ loft, she would point her golden trumpet at him and puff him out of existence. I laughed to myself over the conceit, which at the time I thought very amusing, and sat and chaffed myself and everything else, from the old harpy outside the railing, who had made me pay 10 centimes for my chair before she would let me in. She was more like a basilisk, I told myself, than my organist with the anemic complexion. From that grim old dame to, yes, alas, Monsignor C himself, for all devoutness had fled. I had never yet done such a thing in my life, but now I felt a desire to mock. As for the sermon, I could not hear a word of it for the jingle in my ears of. The skirts of St. Paul have preached as those 6 Lent lectures, more unctuous than ever he preached, keeping time to the most fantastic and irreverent thoughts. It was of no use to sit there any longer. I must get out of doors and shake myself free from this hateful mood. I knew the rudeness I was committing, but still I rose and left the church. A spring sun was shining on the Rue Saint Honore, and as I ran down the church steps, on one corner stood a barrow full of yellow jonquils, pale violets from the Riviera, dark Russian violets and white Russian hyacinth, and golden cloud of mimosa. The streets were full of Sunday pleasure seekers. I swung my cane and laughed with the rest. Someone overtook and passed me. He never turned, but there was the same deadly malignity in his white profile that there had been in his eyes. I watched him as long as I could see him. His lithe back expressed the same menace. Every step that carried him away from me seemed to bear him on no errand connected with my destination. Every step that carried him away from me seemed to bear him on some errand connected with my destruction. I was creeping along, my feet almost refusing to leave. There began to dawn in me a sense of responsibility for something long forgotten. It began to seem as if I deserved that which he threatened. It reached a long way back, a long, long way back. It had laid dormant all those years. It was there, though, and presently would rise and confront me. But I would try to escape, and I stumbled as best I could into the Rue de Rivoli, across the Place de la Concorde, and on to the quay. I looked with sick eyes upon the sun, shining through the white foam of the fountain, pouring over the backs of the dusty bronze river gods on the faraway arc, a structure of amethyst mist on the countless vistas of grey stems and bare branches faintly green. Then I saw him again coming down one of the chestnut alleys on the Cours Lorraine. I left the riverside, plunged blindly across the Champs-Élysées, and turned towards the Arc. The setting sun was sending its rays along the green sward of the Rond Point. In the full glow he sat on a bench, children and young mothers all about him. He was nothing but a Sunday lounger, like the others, like myself. I said the words almost aloud, and all the while I gazed on the malignant hatred of his face. But he was not looking at me. I crept past and dragged my leaden feet up the avenue. I knew that every time I met him brought him nearer to the accomplishment of his purpose and my fate. And still I tried to save myself. The last rays of sunset were pouring through the great arc. I passed under it and met him face to face. I had left him far down the Champs-Élysées, and yet he came in with a stream of people who were returning from the Bois de Boulogne. He came so close that he brushed me. His slender frame felt like iron inside its loose black covering. He showed no sign of haste nor of fatigue, nor of any human feeling. His whole being expressed one thing: the will, the power to work me. The power to work me evil. In anguish I watched him where he went down the broad, crowded avenue that was all flashing with wheels and the trappings of horses and the helmets of the Garde Republicaine. He was soon lost to sight. Then I turned and fled into the Bois, and far out beyond it. I know not where I went, but after a long while, as it had seemed to me, night had fallen, and I found myself sitting at the table before a small cafe. I had wandered back into the Bois. It was hours now since I had seen him. Physical fatigue and mental suffering had left me no power to think or feel. I was tired, so tired. I longed to hide away in my own den. I resolved to go home, but that was a long way off. I live in the Court of the Dragon, a narrow passage that leads from the Rue de Rene to the Rue du Dragon. It is an impasse, traversable only for foot passengers. Over the entrance of the Rue du Rene is a balcony supported by an iron dragon. Within the court, tall old houses rise on either side, and close the ends that give on the two streets. Huge gates swung back during the day into the walls of the deep archways closed this court, and after midnight, one must enter them by ringing at certain small doors on the side. The sunken pavement collects in savoury pools. Steep stairways pitch down to doors that open onto the court. The ground floors are occupied by shops of second-hand dealers and by ironworkers. All day long the place rings with the clink of hammers and the clang of metal bars. Unsavoury as it is below, there is a cheerfulness and comfort and hard, honest work here, and hard, honest work above. 5 flights up are the ateliers of architects and painters, and the hiding place of middle-aged students like myself who want to live alone. When I first came here to live, I was young and not alone. I had to walk a while before any conveyance appeared, but at last, when I had almost reached the Arc de Triomphe again, an empty cab came along and I took it. Now, quick drink. I wonder if Salvi watched the videos and You mean the pizza one? Yeah, I did. It was interesting. And Mana redeemed a hydrate. Thank you for the drink. Oh. Uh-huh. From the Arc to the Rue de Rennais is a drive of more than half an hour, especially when one is conveyed by a tired cab horse that has been at the mercy of the Sunday fade makers. There had been time before I passed under the dragon's wings to meet my enemy over and over again, but I never saw him once, and now refuge was close at hand. Before the wide gateway, a small mob of children were playing. A concierge and his wife walked among them, with their black poodle, keeping order. Some couples were waltzing on the sidewalk. I returned their greetings and hurried on. All the inhabitants of the court had trooped out into the street. The place was quite deserted, lighted by a few lanterns hung high up, in which the gas burned bright dimly. My apartment was at the top of the house, halfway down the court, reached by a staircase that descended almost into the street, with only a bit of passageway intervening. I set my foot on the threshold of the open door. The friendly old ruin of stairs rose before me, leading up to rest and shelter. Looking back over my right shoulder, I saw him 10 paces off. He must have entered the courtyard with me. He was coming straight on, neither slowly nor swiftly, but straight on to me. And now he was looking at me. For the first time since our eyes encountered across the church, they met again, and I knew that the time had come. Retreating backward down the court, I faced him. I meant to escape by the entrance of the Rue de Dragon. His eyes told me that I never should escape. It seemed ages while we were going, I retreating, he advancing, down the court in perfect silence. But at last I felt the shadow of the archway, and the next step brought me within it. I had meant to turn here and spring through into the street. But the shadow was not that of an archway, it was that of a vault. The great doors on the Rue de Dragon were closed. I felt this by the blackness which surrounded me, and at the same instant I read it in his face. How his face gleamed in the darkness, drawing swiftly nearer. The deep vaults, the huge closed doors, the cold iron clamps were all on his side. The thing which he had threatened had arrived. It gathered and bore down on me from the fathomless shadows, the point from which it would strike from his internal eyes. Hopeless, I set my back against the barred doors and defied him. There was a scraping of chairs on the stone floor and a rustling as the congregation rose. I could hear the Suis's staff in the south aisle, preceding the Monsignor C to his sacristy. The kneeling nuns, roused from their devout abstraction, made their reverence and went away. The fashionable lady, my neighbour, rose also, with graceful reserve. As she departed, her glance just flitted over my face in disapproval. Half dead, or so it seemed to me, yet intensely alive to every trifle, I sat among the leisurely moving crowd, then rose too and went toward the door. I had slept through the sermon. Had I slept through the sermon? I looked up and saw him passing across the gallery to his place. Only his side I saw. The thin bent arm in its black covering looked like one of the devilish nameless instruments which lie in the disused torture chambers of medieval castles. I had escaped him, though his eyes had said I should not. Had I escaped him? That which gave him the power over me came back out of oblivion, where I had hoped to keep it. For I knew him now. Death in the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him. They had changed him for every other eye, but not for mine. I recognised him almost from the first. I had never doubted what he had come to do, and now I knew while my body sat still in the cheerful little church, he had been hunting my soul in the court of the dragon. I crept to the door. The organ broke out overhead with a blare. A dazzling light filled the church, blotting the altar from my eyes. The people faded away, the arches of the vaulted roof vanished. I raised my seared eyes to the fathomless glare, and I saw the black stars hanging in the heavens, and the wet winds from the lake of Hanley chilling my face. And now, far away, over leagues of tossing cloud waves, I saw the moon dripping with spray, and beyond the towers of Carcosa rode behind the moon. Death in the awful abode of lost souls. Whither my weakness long ago had sent him, had changed him for every other eye but mine. Now I heard his voice, rising and swelling, thundering through the flaring light, and as I fell, the radiance increasing, poured over me in waves of flame. Then I sunk into the depths, and I heard the king in yellow whispering to my soul, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." Oh, or maybe third through the book. Next chapter. The Yellow Sign. Let the red dawn surmise what we shall do when the blue starlight dies and all is through. There are so many things which are impossible to explain. Why should certain chords in music make me think of the brown and golden tints of autumn foliage? Why should the mass of St. Cecile bend my thoughts wandering among caverns whose walls blaze with ragged masses of virgin silver? What was in the roar and toil of Broadway at 6 o'clock that flashed before my eyes? The picture of a still Breton forest, where sunlight filtered through the spring foliage, and Sylvia bent, half curiously, half tenderly, over a small green lizard, murmuring, "To think that is also a little ward of God." When I first saw the watchman, his back was towards me. I looked at him indifferently until he went into the church. I paid no more attention to him than I had to any man who lounged through Washington Square that morning, and when I shut my window and turned back into my studio, I had forgotten him. Late in the afternoon, the day being warm, I raised the window again and leaned out to get a sniff of air. A man was standing in the courtyard of the church, and I noticed him again with as little interest as I had that morning. I looked across the square to where the fountain was playing, and then, with my mind filled with vague impressions of trees, asphalt drives, and the moving groups of nursemaids and holiday makers, I started to walk back to my easel. As I turned, my listless glance included the man below in the churchyard. His face was towards me now, and with a perfectly involuntary movement I bent to see it. At the same time he raised his head and looked at me. Instantly I thought of a coffin worm. Whatever it was about that man that repelled me I did not know, but the impression of a plump white grave worm was so intense and nauseating that I must have shown it in my expression, for he turned his puppy face away with a movement which made me think of a disturbed grub in a chestnut. I went back to my easel and mentioned the model to resume her pose. After working a while, I was satisfied that I was spoiling what I had done as rapidly as possible, and I took up a palette knife and scraped the colour out again. The flesh tones were sallow and healthy, and I did not understand how I could have painted such sickly colour into a study which before had glowed with healthy tones. I looked at Tessie. She had not changed, and the clear flush of health dyed her cheeks and neck as I frowned. Is it something I've done? She said. No, I've made a mess of this arm, and for the life of me I can't see how I came to paint such mud as that into the canvas, I replied. Don't I pose well? Of course, perfectly. Then it's not my fault. No, it's my own. I am very sorry. I told her she could rest while I applied rag and turpentine to the plague spot on my canvas, and she went off to smoke a cigarette and look over the illustrations in the Courrier Français. I did not know whether it was something in the turpentine or defect in the canvas, but the more I scrubbed, the more that gangrene seemed to spread. I worked like a beaver to get it out, and the disease appeared to creep from limb to limb of the study before me. Alarmed, I strove to arrest it, but now the colour on the breast changed, and the whole figure seemed to absorb the infection as a sponge soaks up water. Vigorously I applied palette knife, turpentine, and scraper, thinking all the time what a seance I should hold with Duval, who had sold me the canvas. But soon I noticed that it was not the canvas which was affected, nor yet the colours of Edward. It must be the turpentine, I thought angrily. Or else my eyes have become so blurred and confused by the afternoon light that I can't see straight. I called Tessie, the model. She came and leaned over my chair, blowing rings of smoke into the air. What have you been doing to it? Nothing, I growled. It must be the turpentine. What a horrible colour it is now, she continued. Do you think my flesh resembles green cheese? No, I don't, I said angrily. Did you ever know me to paint like that before? No, indeed. Well, then. It must be the turpentine or something, she admitted. Shall I return? We'll be lurking till then. Behave everyone, or bring. Have a nice lurk, Manor. She slipped on a Japanese robe and walked to the window. I scraped and rubbed until I was tired and finally picked up the brushes and hurled them through the canvas with a forcible expression, the tone alone of which reached Tessie's ears. Nevertheless, she promptly began. That's it. Swear and act silly and ruin your brushes. You have been 3 weeks on that study, and now look. What's the good of ripping the canvas? What creatures artists are. I felt about as much as ashamed as I usually did after such an outbreak, and I turned the ruined canvas to the wall. Tessie helped me clean my brushes and then danced away to dress. From the screen she regaled me with bits of advice concerning whole or partial loss of temper, until, thinking perhaps I had been tormented sufficiently, she came out to implore me to button her waist where she could not reach it over the shoulder. Everything went wrong from the time you came back from the window and talked about that horrid-looking man you saw in the churchyard, she announced. Yes, he probably bewitched the picture, I said, yawning. I looked at my watch. It's after 6, I know, said Tessie, adjusting her hat before the mirror. Yes, I replied. I didn't mean to keep you so long. I leaned out the window, but recalled with disgust for the young man with the pasty face stood below in the churchyard. Tessie saw my gesture of disapproval and leaned into the window. Is that the man you don't like? She whispered. I nodded. I can't see his face, but he does look fat and soft. Some way or another. She continued, turning to look to me. He reminds me of a dream, an awful dream I once had. She mused, looking down at her shapely shoes. Was it a dream after all? How should I know? I smiled. Tessie smiled in reply. You were in it, so perhaps you might know something about it. Tessie, I protested. Don't you dare flatter by saying that you dream about me. But I did, she insisted. Shall I tell you about it? Go ahead, I said, lighting a cigarette. Tessie leaned back on the open windowsill and began very seriously. One night last winter, I was lying in bed thinking about nothing at all in particular. I had been posing for you and I was tired out, yet it seemed impossible for me to sleep. I heard the bells in the city ringing 10, 11 and midnight. I must have fallen asleep about midnight because I don't remember hearing the bells after that. It seemed to me that I had scarcely closed my eyes when I dreamed that something impelled me to go to the window. I rose and, raising the sash, leaned out. 25th Street was deserted as far as the eye could see. I began to be afraid. Everything outside seemed so black and uncomfortable. Then the sound of wheels in the distance came to my ears, and it seemed to me as though that what I were that what and it seemed to me as though that was what I must wait for. Very slowly the wheels approached, and finally I could make out a vehicle moving along the street. It came nearer and nearer, and when it passed beneath my window, I saw it was a hearse, and then I trembled with fear. The driver turned and looked straight at me. When I awoke, I was standing by the open window, shivering with cold, but the black-plumed hearse and the driver were gone. I had dreamed this dream again last March, and again woke beside the open window. Last night the dream came again. You remember how it was raining when I woke, standing at the open window? My nightdress was soaked. Well, where did I come into the dream? I asked. You were in the coffin, but you were not dead. In the coffin? Yes. How did you know? Could you see me? No, I only knew you were there. Have you been eating Welsh rarebits or lobster salad? I began laughing, but the girl interrupted me with a frightened cry. Hello, what's up? I said. Hello, what's up? I said as she shrank in the embrasure by the window. The man below in the churchyard, he drove the hearse. Nonsense, I said, but Tessie's eyes were wide with terror. I went to the window and looked out. The man was gone. Come now, Tessie, don't be foolish. You have posed too long, you are nervous. Lord Rick? Like in the old days when they diagnosed women with women and gave you cocaine to solve every illness, I assume. You know what will cure this anxiety? Cocaine! Do you think I could forget that face? She murmured. 3 times I saw the hearse pass below my window, and every time the driver turned and looked up at me. Oh, his face was so white and soft. It looked dead, as if it had been dead for a long time. I induced the girl to sit down and swallow a glass of Marsala. Then I sat down beside her and tried to give her some advice. Look here, Tessie. You go to the country for a week or two, and you'll have no more dreams about hearses. You pose all day, and when night comes, your nerves are upset. You can't keep this up. Then again, instead of going to bed when your day's work is done, you run off to picnics at Salzar's Bar, or go to the Eldorado or Coney Island, and when you come down here next morning, you are fagged out. Fagged out? Never heard that phrase before. There was no real hearse, there was a soft shell crab dream. She smiled faintly. What about the man in the churchyard? Oh, he's only an ordinary, unhealthy, everyday creature. As true as my name is Tessie Reardon, I swear to you, Mr. Scott, that the face of the man below in the churchyard is the face of the man who drove the hearse. What of it? I said. It's an honest trade. Do you think I did see a hearse? Oh, I said dogmatically, if you really did, it might not be unlikely that the man below drove it. There is nothing in that. Tessie rose and rolled her scented handkerchief, and taking a bit of gum from a knot in the hem, placed it in her mouth. Then, drawing on her gloves, she offered me her hand with a frank "Good night, Mr. Scott," and walked out. The next morning, Thomas the bellboy brought me the Herald and a bit of news. The church next door had been sold. I thanked heaven for it, not that being a Catholic I had any repugnance for the congregation next door, but because my nerves were shattered by a blatant exhorter, whose every word echoed through the aisle of the church as if it had been my own rooms, and who insisted on his R's with a nasal persistence which revolted my every instinct. Then, too, there was a fiend in human shape, an organist, who reeled off some of the grand old hymns with an interpretation of his own, and I longed for the blood of a creature who could play the doxology with an amendment of minor chords, which one hears only in a quartet of very young undergraduates. I believe the minister was a good man, but when he bellowed, "And the Lord said unto Moses, the Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name. My wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you With the sword. I wondered how many centuries of purgatory it would take to atone for such a sin. Who brought the poverty? I asked Thomas. Nobody that I know, sir. They do say the gents what owns this out on flats were looking into it. He might be a building more studios. I walked to the window. The young man with the unhealthy face stood by the churchyard gate, and at the mere sight of him and the same overwhelming repugnance took possession of me. By the way, Thomas, I said, who's that fellow down there? Thomas sniffed. That there worm, sir. He's night watchman of the church, sir. He makes me tired of sitting out all night on them. He makes me tired of sitting out all night on them steps and looking at you, insulting like. I'd have punched his head, sir. Beg pardon, sir. Go on, Thomas. One night I come in home with Harry, the other English boy. I sees him a sitting there on the steps. We had Molly and Jem with us, sir, the two girls on the tray services, and he looked so insulting at us that I up and said, "What are you looking at, you fat slug?" Beg pardon, sir. But that's how I says, sir. Then he don't say nothing, and I says, "Come out and I'll punch that pudding head." Then I opens the gate and he goes. Then I opens the gate and goes in. But he don't say nothing, only looking insulting like. Then I hits him one, but his head was that cold and mushy it'd sicken you to touch him. What did he do then? Him? Nothing. And you, Thomas? The young fellow flushed with embarrassment and smiled uneasily. Mr. Scott, sir, I ain't no coward, and I can't make it out all the way I ran. I was in 5th Lawrence, sir, bugler at Tel El Kabir, and was shot by the wells. You don't mean to say you ran away? Yes, sir, I run. Why? That's just what I want to know, sir. I grabbed Molly and run, and the rest was as frightened as I. But what were they frightened at? Thomas refused to answer for a while, but now my curiosity was aroused by the repulsive young man below, and I pressed him. 3 years' sojourn in America not only modified Thomas's Cockney accent, but had given him the American's fear of ridicule. You won't believe me, Mr. Scott, sir. Yes, I will. You will laugh at me, sir. Nonsense. He hesitated. Well, sir, it's God's truth that when I hit him, he grabbed my wrist, sir, and when I twisted his soft, mushy fist, one of his fingers come off in me hand. The utter loathing and horror of Thomas's face must have been reflected in my own. He added, "It's awful. And now when I see him, I just go away. He makes me ill." Oh no, they're in the back rooms. The cutie is lost. The back rooms are mine. I love the back rooms. When Thomas had gone, I went to the window. The man stood beside the church railing with both hands on the gate, but I hastily retreated to my easel again, sickened and horrified, for I saw that the middle finger of his right hand was missing. At 9 o'clock Tessie appeared, and vanished behind the screen with a merry "Good morning, Mr. Scott." When she had reappeared and taken a pose upon the model stand, I started a new canvas, much to her delight. She remained silent as long as I was on the drawing, but as soon as the scrape of the charcoal ceased and I took up my fixative, she began to chatter. "Oh, I had such a lovely time last night. We went to Tony Pastor's." "Who are we?" I demanded. "Oh, Maggie, you know, Mr. White's model, and Pinky McCormick. We call her Pinky because she's got that beautiful red hair you artists like so much, and Lizzie Burke." I sent a shower of spray from the fixative over the canvas, and she said, well, go on. "We saw Kelly and Baby Barnes, the skirt dancer, and all the rest. I made a mash." "Then you have gone back on me, Tessie?" She laughed and shook her head. "He's Lizzie Burke's brother Ed. He's a perfect gentleman." I felt constrained to give her some parental advice concerning mashing, which she took with a bright smile. "Oh, I can take care of a strange mash," she said, examining her chewing gum. But Ed is different. Lizzie is my best friend. Then she related how Ed had come back from the stocking mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, to find her and Lizzie grown up, and what an accomplished young man he was, and how he thought nothing of squandering $50 for ice cream and oysters to celebrate his entry as clerk into the woolen department of Macy's. Godly, hi. Thank you for the follow. Before she finished, I began to paint, and she resumed the pose, smiling and chattering like a sparrow. By noon, I had the study fairly well rubbed in, and Tessie came to look at it. That's better, she said. I thought so too, and ate my lunch with a satisfied feeling that all was going well. Tessie spread her lunch on a drawing table opposite me, and we drank our claret from the same bottle and lighted our cigarettes from the same match. I was very much attached to Tessie. I had watched her shoot up into a slender but exquisitely formed woman from a frail, awkward child. She had posed me during the last 3 years, and among all my models, she was my favourite. It would have troubled me very much indeed had she become a tough or fly, as the phrase goes. But I never noticed any deterioration of her manner, and felt at heart that she was all right. She and I never discussed morals at all, and I had no intention of doing so, partly because I had none myself, and partly because I knew she would do what she liked in spite of me. Still, I did hope she would steer clear of complications, because I wished her well, and that also I had a selfish desire to retain the best model I had. I knew that mashing, as she termed it, had no significance with girls like Tessie, and that such things in America did not resemble in the least the same things in Paris. Yet, having lived with my eyes open, I also knew that somebody would take Tessie away some day, in one manner or another, and though I professed to myself that marriage was nonsense, I sincerely hoped that in this case there would be a priest at the end of the vista. I am a Catholic. When I listen to High Mass, when I sign myself, I feel that everything, including myself, is more cheerful, and when I confess it does me good. A man who lives as much alone as I do must confess to somebody. Then again, Sylvia was Catholic, and it was reason enough for me. But I was speaking of Tessie, which was very different. Tessie also was Catholic, and much more devout than I, so taking it all in then, I had little fear for my pretty model until she should fall in love. But then I knew that fate alone would decide her future for her, and I prayed inwardly that fate would keep her away from men like me and throw her into the path and throw into her path nothing but Ed Burks and Jimmy McCormick's, bless her sweet face. Tessie sat blowing rings of smoke up to the ceiling and tinkling ice in her tumbler. Do you know that I also had a dream last night? I observed. Not about the man, she laughed. Exactly, a dream similar to yours, but much worse. Oh, we got first, and stop shrimping. Have a stretch. Thank you, Godly. A little drink as well. It was foolish and thoughtless of me to say this, but you know how little tact the average painter has. I must have fallen asleep about 10 o'clock, I continued, and after a while I dreamt that I was awake. So plainly did I hear the midnight boughs that wind in the tree branches and the whistle of steamers from the bay that even now I can scarcely believe I was not awake. I seemed to be lying in a box which had a glass cover. Dimly I saw the street lamps as I passed, for I must tell you, Tessie, the box in which I reclined appeared to lie in a cushioned wagon, which jolted me over a stony pavement. After a while I became impatient and tried to move, but the box was too narrow. My hands were crossed on my breast, so I could not raise them to help myself. I listened and then tried to call. My voice was gone, and I could hear the trample of the horses attached to the wagon, and even the breathing of the driver. Then another sound broke upon my ears like the raising of a window sash. I managed to turn my head a little, and I found I could look, not only through the glass cover of my box, but also through the glass panes in the side of the covered vehicle. I saw houses empty and silent, with neither light nor life about any of them except one, and in that house I saw a window was open on the first floor, and a figure all in white stood there looking down on the street. It was you. Tessie had turned her face away from me and leaned on the table with her elbow. I could see your face, I resumed, and it seemed to me to be very sorrowful. When we passed on and turned into the narrow back lane, presently the horses stopped. I waited and waited, closing my eyes with ear and impatience. But all was silent as the grave. After what seemed to me hours, I began to feel uncomfortable. A sense that somebody was close to me made me unclose my eyes. Then I saw the white face of the hearse driver looking at me through the coffin lid. A sob from Tessie interrupted me. She was trembling like a leaf. I saw I had made an ass of myself and attempted to repair the damage. Why, Tess, I said, I only told you this to show you that what influence your story might have on another person's dreams. You don't suppose I really lay in a coffin, do you? What are you trembling for? Don't you see that your dream and my unreasonable dislike for that inoffensive watchman of the church simply set my brain working as soon as I fell asleep? She laid her head between her arms and sobbed as if her heart would break. What a precious triple donkey I had made of myself. While I was about to break my record, I went over and put my arm about her. Tessie, dear, forgive me, I said. I had no business to frighten you with such nonsense. You are too sensible a girl, too good a Catholic to believe in dreams. Her hand tightened on mine, and her head fell back upon my shoulder, but she still trembled, and I petted her and comforted her. Come, Tess, open your eyes and smile. Her eyes opened with a slow, languid movement of mine, but their expression was so queer, and I hastened to reassure her again. It's all humbug, Tessie. You surely are not afraid that any harm will come to you because of that? No, she said, but her scarlet lips quivered. Then what's the matter? Are you afraid? No, not for myself. For me, then? I demanded gaily. For you, she murmured in a voice almost inaudible. I care for you. At first I started to laugh, but when I understood her, a shock passed through me, and I sat like one turned to stone. This was the crowning bit of idiocy I had committed. During the moment which had elapsed between her reply and my answer, I thought of 1,000 responses to that innocent confession. I could pass it by with a laugh, I could misunderstand her and assure her as to my health. I could simply point out that it was impossible she could love me. But my reply was quicker than my thoughts, and I might think now, when it was too late, for I had kissed her on the mouth. That evening I took my usual walk in Washington Park, pondering over the occurrences of the day. I was thoroughly committed. There was no back out now, and I stared the future straight into the face. I was not good, not even scrupulous, but I had no idea of deceiving myself or Tessie. That one passion of my life lay buried in the sunlit forests of Brittany. Was it buried forever? Hope cried, no. For 3 years I had been listening to the voice of Hope, and for 3 years I had waited for his footstep on my threshold. Had Sylvia forgotten? No, cried Hope. I said that I was no good. That is true, but still I was not exactly a comic opera villain. I had led an easy-going, reckless life, taking what invited me of pleasure, deploring and sometimes bitterly regretting the consequences. In one thing alone, except my painting, was I serious, and that was something which lay hidden, if not lost, in the Breton forests. Let's have a little drink again. I think I just dropped my tablet pens down there. It was too late for me to regret what had occurred during the day. Whatever it had been, pity, a sudden tenderness for sorrow, or the more brutal instinct of gratified vanity, it was all the same now, and unless I wished to bruise an innocent heart, My path lay marked before me. The fire and strength, the depth of passion of a love which I had never even suspected, with all my imagined experiences in the world, left me no alternative but to respond or send her away. Whether because I was so cowardly about giving pain to others, or whether it was that I have little of the gloomy Puritan in me, I did not know. But I shrank from disclaiming responsibility for that thoughtful kiss, and in fact had no time to do so before the gates of her heart opened and the flood poured forth. Others who habitually do their duty and find a sullen satisfaction in making themselves and everybody else unhappy might have withstood it. I did not. I dared not. After the storm had abated, I did tell her that she might better have looked at Ed Burke and wore on a plain gold ring, but she would not hear of it. And I thought perhaps as long as she had decided to love somebody she could not marry, it had better be me. I at least could treat her with an intelligent affection, and whenever she became tired of her infatuation, she could go none the worse for it. For I was decided on that point, although I know how hard it would be. I remembered the usual termination of platonic liaisons, and thought how disgusted I had been whenever I heard of one. I knew I was undertaking a great deal for so unscrupulous a man as I was, and I dreamed the future, but never for one moment did I doubt that she was safe with me. Had it been anybody but Tessie, I should not have bothered my head about scruples, for it did not occur to me to sacrifice Tessie as I would have sacrificed a woman of the world. I looked the future squarely in the face and saw the several probable endings of the affair. She would either tire of the whole thing, or become so unhappy that I should have either to marry her or go away. If I married her, we would be unhappy. I with a wife unsuited to me, and she with a husband unsuitable for any woman. For my past life could scarcely entitle me to marry. If I went away, she might either fall ill, recover, or marry some Eddie Burke, or she might recklessly and deliberately go and do something foolish. On the other hand, if she tired of me, then her whole life would be before her without beautiful vistas of Eddie Burke, with beautiful vistas of Eddie Burkes and marriage rings and twins and Harlem flats and heaven knows what. As I strolled through the trees by the Washington Arch, I decided that she should find a substantial friend in me anyway, and the future could take care of itself. Then I went into the house and put on my evening dress, with a little faintly perfumed note on my dress that said, "Have a cab at the stage door at 11." And the note was signed Edith Carmichael, Metropolitan Theatre. I took supper that night, or rather we took supper, Miss Carmichael and I, at Solari's, and the dawn was just beginning to gild the cross on the memorial church as I entered Washington Square after leaving Edith at the Brunswick. There was not a soul in the park as I passed along the trees and took the walk which leads from the Garibaldi statue to the Hamilton apartment house, but as I passed the churchyard I saw a figure on the stone steps. In spite of myself, a chill crept over me at the sight of the white face, and I hastened to pass. Then he said something which might not have been addressed to me, or might merely have been a mutter to himself, but a certain furious anger flamed up within me that such a creature should address me. For an instant I felt like wheeling about and smashing my stick over his head, but I walked on and entered the Hamilton, and entering the Hamilton went to my apartment. For some time I tossed about the bed trying to get the sound of his voice out of my ears, but could not. It filled my head, the muttering sound, that thick oily smoke from a fat rendering vat, or an odour of some noise and decay. As I lay and tossed about, his voice in my ears seemed more distinct, and I began to understand the words he had murmured. They came to me so slowly as if I had forgotten them, and at last I could make some sense of their sounds. It was this: "Have you found the yellow sign? Have you found the yellow sign? Have you found the yellow sign?" I was furious. What did he mean by that? Then, with a curse upon him and his, I rolled over and went to sleep. But when I awoke later, I looked pale and haggard, for I had dreamed the dream of the night before, and it troubled me more than I cared to think. Uh, I dressed and went into my studio. Tessie sat by the window, but as I came in, she rose and put arms around my neck for an innocent kiss. She looked so sweet and dainty that I kissed her again and then sat down before the easel. Hello. Where's the studio I began yesterday? Tessie looked conscious, but did not answer. I began to hunt among the piles of canvases, saying, "Hurry up, Tessie, and get ready. We must take advantage of the morning light." When at last I gave up the search among the other canvases and turned to look around the room for the missing study, I noticed Tessie standing by the screen with her clothes still on. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Don't you feel well?" "Yes." "Then hurry. Do you want me to pose as I have always posed?" Then I understood. Here was a new complication. I had lost, of course, the best nude model I had ever seen. I looked at Tessie. Her face was scarlet. Alas, alas, we had eaten of the tree of knowledge, and Eden and native innocence were dreams of the past. I mean, for her. I suppose she noticed the disappointment on my face when she said, "I will pose if you wish. The study is behind the screen here where I put it." "No," I said. "We will begin something new." And I went into my wardrobe and picked out a Moorish costume which fairly blazed with tinsel. It was a genuine costume, and Tessie retired to the screen with it enchanted. When she came forth again, I was astonished. Her long blonde hair was bound over her head with a circlet of turquoises, and the end curls about her glittering girdle. Her feet were encased in embroidered pointed slippers, and the skirt of her costume, curiously wrought with arabesques and silver, fell to her ankles. The deep metallic blue vest embroidered with silver, and the short Moresque jacket, spangled and sewn with turquoise, became her wonderfully. She came up to me and held up her face, smiling. I slipped my hand into my pocket, and drawing out a gold chain with a cross attached, dropped it over her head. "It's yours, Tessie." "Mine?" she faltered. "Yours. Now go and pose." Then, with a radiant smile, she ran behind the screen and presently reappeared with a little box on which was written my name. "I had intended to give it to you when I went home last night, but now I can't wait." I opened the box. On the pink cotton inside lay a clasp of black onyx, on which was inlaid a curious symbol or letter in gold. It was neither Arabic nor Chinese, nor, as I found out afterwards, did it belong to any human script. "It's all I had to give you for a keepsake," she said timidly. I was annoyed, but I told her how much I should prize it, and promised to wear it always. She fastened it on my coat beneath the label. "How foolish, Tess, to go and buy me such a beautiful thing as this," I said. "I did not buy it." She laughed. "Where did you get it?" Then she told me of how she found it one day while coming from the aquarium in the Battery, how she had advertised it and watched the papers, but at last gave up all hopes of finding the owner. "That was last winter," she said. "The very day I had the first horrid dream about the hearse." I remembered my dream of the previous night, but said nothing, and presently my charcoal was flying over the new canvas, and Tessie stood motionless on the model stand. The day following was disastrous for me. While moving a framed canvas from one easel to another, my foot slipped on the polished floor, and I fell heavily on both wrists. They were so badly strained that it was useless to attempt to hold a brush, and I was obliged to wander around the studio, glaring at unfinished drawings and sketches, until despair seized me and I sat down to smoke and twiddle my thumbs with rage. The rain blew against the windows and rattled on the roof of the church, driving me into a nervous fit with its intermittent patter. Tessie sat sewing by the window, and every now and then raised her head and looked at me with such innocent compassion that I began to feel ashamed of my irritation and looked about for something to occupy me. I had read all the papers and all the books in the library, and for the sake of something to do, I went to the bookcase and shoved them open with my elbow. I knew every volume by its colour and examined them all, passing slowly around the library and whistling to keep up my spirits. I was turning to go into the dining room when my eye fell upon a book bound in serpent skin, standing in the corner of the top shelf of my last bookcase. I did not remember it, and from the door could not decipher the pale lettering on the back, so I went to the smoking room and called Tessie. She came in from the studio and climbed up to reach the book. "What is it?" I asked. "The King in Yellow." I was dumbfounded. Who had placed it there? How came it in my rooms? I had long ago decided that I should never open that book, and nothing on earth could have persuaded me to buy it. Fearful lest curiosity might tempt me to open it, I had never even looked at it in bookstores. If I ever had any curiosity to read it, the awful tragedy of young Castaigne, whom I knew, prevented me from exploring its wicked pages. Ah, Castaigne was the character from the first chapter. I had always refused to listen to any description of it, and indeed, nobody ever ventured to discuss the second part out loud, so I had absolutely no knowledge of what leaves might reveal, of what those leaves might reveal. I stared at the poisonous metal binding as I would at a snake. "Don't touch it, Tessie," I said. "Come down." Of course, my admonition was enough to arouse her curiosity, and before I could prevent it, she took the book and, laughing, danced off into the studio with it. I called to her, when she slipped away with a tormenting smile at my helpless hands, and I followed her with some impatience. "Tessie," I cried, entering the library, "listen, I am serious. Put that book away. I do not wish you to open it." The library was empty. I went into both drawing rooms, then into the bedrooms, laundry, kitchen, and finally returned to the library and began a systematic search. She had hidden herself so well that it was half an hour later when I discovered her crouching white and silent but by the lattice window in the storeroom above. At the first glance I saw that she had been punished for her foolishness. The King in Yellow lay at her feet, but the book was open at the second part. I looked at Tessie and saw it was too late. She had opened The King in Yellow. Then I took her by the hand and led her into the studio. She seemed dazed, and when I told her to lie down on the sofa, she obeyed me without a word. And after a while she closed her eyes and her breathing became regular and deep, but I could not determine whether or not she was asleep. For a long while I sat silently beside her, but she neither stirred nor spoke, and at last I rose and, entering the unused storeroom, took the book in my least injured hand. It seemed as heavy as lead, but I carried it to the studio again, and sitting down on the rug beside the sofa, opened it and read it through beginning to end. When, faint with excess of emotions, I dropped the volume and leaned wearily back against the sofa, Tessie opened her eyes and looked at me. We had been speaking for some time in a dull, monotonous strain, before I realised we were discussing The King in Yellow. Oh, the sin of writing such words which are clear as crystal, limpid and musical as bubbling springs, words which sparkle and glow like the poisonous diamonds of the Medicis. Oh, the wickedness, the hopeless damnation of a soul who could fascinate and paralyse human creatures with such words. Words understood by the ignorant and wise alike. Words which are more precious than jewels, more soothing than music, more awful than death. We talked on, unmindful of the gathering shadows, and she was begging me to throw away the clasp of black onyx, quaintly inlaid with what we now knew to be the yellow sign. I never shall know why I refused, though even at this hour, here in the bedroom as I wrote this confession, I should be glad to know what it was that prevented me from tearing the yellow sign from my breast and casting it into the fire. I am sure I wished to do so, and yet Tessie pleaded with me in vain. Night fell, and the hours dragged on, but still we murmured to each other of the king and the pallid mask. The midnight sounded from the misty spires and the fog-wrapped city. We spoke of Hasta and of Casilda, while outside the fog rolled against the black window panes as the cloud waves roll and break on the shores of Hali. The house was very silent now, and not a sound came up from the misty streets. Tessie lay among the cushions, her face a grey blot in the gloom, but her hands were clasped in mine, and I knew that she knew and read my thoughts as I read hers, for we had understood the mysteries of the Hyades and the phantom of truth was laid. Then, as we answered each other, swiftly, silently, thought on thought, the shadows stirred in the gloom about us, and far in the distant streets we heard a sound. Nearer and nearer it came, the dull crunching of wheels, nearer and yet nearer. And now, outside before the door it ceased, and I dragged myself to the window and saw a black-plumed hearse. The gate below opened and shut, and I crept shaking to my door and bolted it. But I knew no bolts, no locks, could keep that creature who was coming for the yellow sign. And now I heard him moving very softly along the hall. Now he was at the door, and the bolts rotted at his touch. Now he has entered. With eyes starting from my head, I peered into the darkness, but when he came into my room, I did not see him. It was only when I felt him envelop me in his cold, soft grasp that I cried out and struggled with deadly fury. But my hands were useless, and he tore the onyx clasp from my coat and struck me full in the face. Then, as I fell, I heard Tessie's soft cry, and her spirit fled. And even while falling, I longed to follow her, for I knew that the king in yellow had opened his tattered mantle, and there was only God to cry to now. I could tell more, but I cannot see what help it would do to the world. As for me, I am past human help or hope. As I lie here writing, careless even whether or not I die before I finish, I can see the doctor gathering up his powders and phials with a vague gesture to the good priest beside me, which I understand. They will be very curious to know the tragedy. They of the outside world who write books and print millions of newspapers, but I shall write no more. And the Father Confessor will seal my last words with the seal of sanctity when his holy office is done. They of the outside world may send their creatures into wicked homes and death-smitten firesides, and their newspapers will batten on blood and tears, but with me their spies must halt before the confessional. They know that Tessie is dead and that I am dying. They know how the people in my house, aroused by an infernal scream, rushed into a room and found one living and two dead, and they do not know what I shall tell them now. But they do not know that what I shall tell them now. They do not know that the doctor said, as he pointed to a horrible decomposed heap on the floor, the living corpse of the watchman from the church. I have no theory, no explanation. That man must have been dead for months. I am dying. I wish the priest would. And that's the end of that chapter. Presumably, he died before he could finish. I think that's enough story time for now. Partially because that reading is turning out to be quite killer on my voice. More so than just shit talking. But I hope everyone has had a good time listening. This will be going on YouTube as well, along with the first part. So if you've missed the first part of the book, please feel free to go listen to that. I just returned. Oh no, I'm sorry, Mana. Yeah, I don't think these reading streams are ever going to be that long because my voice is starting to go. And I do need a rest. These are probably going to be my shortest streams possible. So I'm sorry for that. But as I just said, in a few days I will be loading it onto YouTube with the first part, which I think is already there. So if you want to hear how the story's gone so far, please go give it another listen. Or read the book yourself, it's brilliant. I think it's open source now. What's the word for books? Make sure I get plenty of rest. I will. I'm going to have another cup of tea, and I'm just going to not talk for an hour or two. And tomorrow we're playing Prey some more. So that'll be fun. Oh, big yawn. Oh, thank you for dropping in. I'm not actually gonna see who's streaming right now. We can raid. Who is streaming? Let's go by to Rara, who is playing Warframe. Again, I think she may be a little bit addicted. So thank you everyone dropped in, and join us tomorrow for something different again. Well, different, but the same. More video game. More video game.